recording. Okay. So what I thought we would do today is, instead of studying the weekly Torah portion, since there isn't one this Shabbat, it's the holiday of Shavuot. So we have a special Torah reading for the first day of Shavuot and a special one for the second day of Shavuot. And just a slight tangent, it's in Israel, Shabbat is not the second day of Shavuot. It is a regular Shabbat. And so we're going to be off the cycle of Torah readings. So in other words, the Torah readings for us and for Israel will be different until we meet up again, probably in July. Somewhere it gets back together again. But it's one of the unusual elements of the Jewish calendars when second day of Yom Tov outside of Israel falls on Shabbat, then we are not reading the same Torah reading as Israel is. Anyway, so instead of looking at the Torah reading for the first day of Shavuot is the description from chapters 19 and 20 in Exodus of the 10 Commandments and that experience of hearing God's voice at Mount Sinai. And the reading for the second day of Shavuot is taken from the book of Deuteronomy with a reminder of that we're supposed to take care of the poor during and the tithes that are supposed to be designated for the poor, and then also the holidays that are supposed to be celebrated. So instead of talking about that, and that reading for the second day of Shavuot is also done during at the end of Sukkot and at the end of Passover, I thought instead of looking at least the Haftorah for the first day of Shavuot, and depending on the time, maybe we'll look at the Haftorah for the second day of Shavuot, because they are rather bizarre in terms of their description, and perhaps reflect a little bit on an unusual element that's included in the Bible. In other words, what I mean by that is, when we think of the Jewish Bible, we think about, let me say it personally. When I think of the Jewish Bible, I think about law, like what are the commandments we're supposed to follow. I think about the history. We learn about the history of the Jewish people and the history of the world from Genesis until the Babylonians come and conquer Israel and send the people into exile. So the Bible, to me, is law and history. And also the Bible is, in some way, a human encounter with God in terms of really spiritual ways in which, so we have the prophets who are trying to convince the people to return to God, and we have individual mostly individual encounters with God, and we have the book of Psalms too, which is really Hebrew poetry about asking for God to help, to ask for comfort, to cry out to God. So these kinds of things is what I think the Bible is. And then when we encounter something as graphic as Ezekiel's vision, I kind of say, whoa, is this real? What is this? How do we understand this? Because nobody has ever corroborated the evidence of what Ezekiel has seen. So with that as an introduction, if you want to follow along with the Haftorah, in the Eitz Chaim, we're on page 1321. I'm actually going to look at the intro to it on 1320. Otherwise, if you have another edition of the Chumash, look in the table of contents for the Haftorah for the first day of Shavuot. And if you're just reading a Bible or have any edition of the Bible, you're looking for the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 1. but I'm going to be reading a little bit from the introduction from the Eitz Chaim. And I wanted to share the following. So just mainly the first two paragraphs of the introduction. In this Haftorah, Ezekiel reports his vision of the divine glory in Babylon along the Chevar Canal in July 593 BCE. Now, where they get the date from, that you'd have to look up with biblical scholars about that. We know that the Babylonians officially exiled the kingdom, the southern kingdom of Israel in 586. So this is 7 years before that. Slowly, over time, over the course of several years, the Jewish community was exiled to Babylonia. So Ezekiel was there already 7 years before the official exile took place. And the Chevar Canal, we don't know where that is in the empire of Babylon, but that's the location we'll see when we read the Haftorah in a moment. That's the location given us. This experience was part of his inauguration as a prophet, some 5 years after he had been deported from Judea with his fellow exiles. The awesome vision of God's appearance on a throne, supported by a spectacle of creatures amid fiery forms, overwhelmed Ezekiel, who flung himself down on his face. At that point, the vision gives way to what he hears. Rabbinic tradition provides the content of what Ezekiel heard by concluding the Haftorah with a formal expression of praise from a latter passage from chapter 3, blessed is the presence of the Lord, Baruch Kavod Adonai, Mimakomo, blessed is the presence of the Lord in his place. So that's the background. Instead of reading the second paragraph of the intro, let's just get into the Haftorah itself, and we'll see how bizarre this vision is. In the 30th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, when I was in the community of exiles by the Chevar Canal, so that's where we know that it was in July, possibly, the 5th day of the 4th month. Nisan is the 1st month, Iyar is the 2nd month, Sivan is the 3rd month, Tammuz is the 4th month. So Tammuz, this year Tammuz begins in June, so it's June or July, but if you go on Hebcal, you can probably figure out what the secular date in the calendar was. So the 5th day of the 4th month, when I was in the community of exiles by the Chevar Canal, the heavens opened and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. The word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, by the Chevar Canal in the land of the Chaldeans, and the hand of the Lord came upon him there. So mostly Ezekiel is doing the talking. It sounds like here there's a narrator telling us who Ezekiel is. So Ezekiel was a Kohen as well. So that's unusual. Most of the prophets of Israel in the Bible are not Kohanim. They are just plain Israelites. But Ezekiel is a Kohen, which explains later in his book a very detailed description of the temple in Jerusalem and how the sacrifices were offered, several chapters there about what the temple was like. So now on to verse 4. So this is what Ezekiel sees when he's on this canal. I looked, and lo, a stormy wind came sweeping out of the north, a huge cloud and flashing fire, surrounded by a radiance. And in the center of it, in the center of the fire, a gleam as of amber. And the translations, by the way, it's unclear exactly. I mean, this translation that we're using is based on the known scholarship and understanding of the Hebrew language, but we can't. So the amber there, is that really what it is? But also the Hebrew word in the center of the fire, a gleam, the gleam. The Hebrew word is chashmal. And in modern Hebrew, chashmal is electricity. So we can't translate this word based on the modern word of chashmal, because the modern word of chashmal is based on this biblical word of chashmal, and it's only from context that we can understand a little bit what the word chashmal is, but we really don't know. It's some kind of gleam or flash of light, and whether it was amber, we don't, so it's a yellowish kind of flash. Who knows? But it's something bizarre. It sounds like he's seeing a thunderstorm rise up in the distance, and perhaps kind of like heat lightning that we see in the summertime, right? But it's concentrated into this one cloud as opposed to being over the entire horizon. Okay, in the center of it were also the figures of 4 creatures, and this was their appearance. Okay, now get ready for what he sees of this, what these 4 creatures are. They had the figures of human beings. However, each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Okay, so these are human beings, but with 4 faces. 1 head, it sounds like, but 4 faces, and with 4 wings, not 2 wings, okay, which is, we can perhaps be okay with because we're used to angelic beings, but 4 wings, okay. The legs of each were fused into, and that's in the brackets because the Hebrew isn't unclear exactly how these legs were. The legs of each were fused into a single rigid leg, and the feet of each were like a single calf's hoof. And their sparkle was like the luster of burnished bronze. Now the Hebrew there is nechoshet. Nechoshet is copper. So the color of copper is a little bit different than the color of bronze. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is what this being looks like. So the legs are fused into 1 leg, with the foot being a calf's hoof. And there's a sparkle about this creature. So it's a 4-faced, 4-winged, 1-legged, calf hoof, sparkling creature. They had human hands below their wings. Okay, so did they have arms? I don't know, but they had hands below the wings. The 4 of them had their faces and their wings on their 4 sides. Now we know they have 4 sides. So a person, you can imagine a person has 2 sides, a front and a back. So here, this being has 4 sides. Each one's wings touched those of the other. They did not turn when they moved. Each could move in the direction of any of its faces. So let's say a 4-sided square. So imagine our head not being round, but being a square. And we could move to the side, to either side, front or back, and that's what the being could do as well. Okay? Continuing in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 10, each of them had a human face. So this is what the 4 faces look like. Okay? Each of them had a human face at the front. Each of the 4 had the face of a lion on the right. Each of the 4 had the face of an ox on the left. And each of the 4 had the face of an eagle at the back. Okay? So human, lion, ox, and eagle. Those are the 4 faces of this being. Such were their faces. As for their wings, they were separated. Above, each had 2 touching those of the others, while the other 2 covered its body. So perhaps the 2 of the wings were folded into the body, and 2 of the others were stretched out a little bit. and each could move in the direction of any of its faces. They went wherever the Spirit impelled them to go without turning when they moved. So in other words, the face just stayed in its direction, and the being would just move front like robotically in that fashion. Such then was the appearance of the creatures. Okay, so that's enough about the creatures. With them was something that looked like burning coals of fire. And I'm just looking at the Hebrew. Gachalei Eish. Yeah, so those are coals of fire. And you would use that in modern Hebrew too for charcoal. Yeah, is there significance to the specific creatures? I'm getting there, Carl. So we'll see that. We'll talk about that in a moment. This fire, I really, though, Carl, I do want to get to the throne and God. That's really what I wanted to look at, these creatures. All I can say is that there are, in the Christian Bible, I think in the book of Revelations, there is, what is that, that creature that has the 666 on its forehead? I think that's a four-headed creature as well. So all I can say is that later books of the Bible kind of use Ezekiel as a model for these kinds of angelic beings. Okay, and Isaiah has a picture of angelic beings, and they're just called seraphim, these flaming creatures, but they're not described. They're just explained as seraphim and also ophanim. And the new translations don't even bother translating them because it's unclear what they are. So is there significance to this? Yes, in the Zohar, the mystical text, the sacred text of the mystical tradition within Judaism would interpret this a lot. The commentaries, the traditional commentaries on this might say something about this, and I think there could be a reference to these animals in terms of the nations of the earth that they represent. Like the Roman Empire is always compared to an eagle. So is Ezekiel foreseeing, like in the future, these other nations of Israel on this in this creature? I don't know, but that's just the rabbis, the commentators would talk about but so significance, is there any significance to the specific creature? So your question, Carl, the word significance there, it depends what you mean by significant. In terms of it, for me, significance is really only about what impact this has on my Jewish life today. And in that regard, these beings have no significance at all. If, though, this vision helps me try to enter a mystical trance to try to get closer to God, then this would be significant. Because if I didn't see something like this as I was entering into a mystical trance, then I would be wondering, wait a second, Ezekiel saw this. Isn't this what I'm supposed to see? So it depends on what significance you're trying to get out of this. And so my default is not looking for a mystical entree into Judaism. My default for being Jewish is more about ritual and study and spirituality found through prayer. Okay, so for me, this is not significant. For mystics, it is extremely significant. Okay, so let's go on with what Ezekiel is saying. So verse 13 again. Such then was the appearance of the creatures. With them was something that looked like burning coals of fire. This fire, suggestive of torches. Yes, suggestive. So that's interesting because the Hebrew ke mar'e halapidim. So suggestive, I don't know, I would just say that this fire looked like torches, as opposed to suggestive of torches, kept moving about among the creatures. The fire had a radiance, and lightning issued from the fire. Yes, I'm just looking at the Hebrew. Dashing to and fro among the creatures was something that looked like flares. So you have this fire kind of moving around among the creatures. Perhaps it's one fire, maybe a bunch of fires. You got these torches, several torches, one torch, one fire, who knows? Lots of fire going around all these creatures. And you got a bunch of these creatures that are four-faced, human, lion, ox, and eagle, and four wings and hands at the end of the wings, and one leg with a calf hoof, and all the fire. So we'll get to this question in a moment, but keep in mind, what if you saw something like this, what would you do? Verse 15, as I gazed on the creatures, I saw one wheel on the ground next to each of the four-faced creatures. So the word for wheel here is ophan. And those are the similar in the book of Isaiah to the ophanim, which are these creatures that Isaiah sees in God's heavenly court. The modern word for bicycle is ophanayim, two ophanim. So it's not just, so in other words, I'm wearing glasses. These are called mishkafayim, a pair of things in Hebrew. So usually a plural in Hebrew, a masculine plural, is just im, like one book is sefer, two books is sefarim. But if you have a pair of something, it would transform the word to this ayim. So two eyes are einayim, two ears are oznayim, glasses are mishkafayim. So a bicycle, because it's a two-wheeled vehicle, ophanayim. Okay, but one is ophan. So I'm not sure if a unicycle is called an ophan in modern Hebrew, but it could be. So again, the modern Hebrew word for a bicycle is ophanayim, based on ophan from here and from Isaiah. Is that what the ophan really was? I don't know, because if you go to a biblical dictionary, the scholar who wrote that dictionary would translate it as wheel. But I would argue we really don't know what the word means. Is it fair to translate a word based on the modern use of the word in its biblical form? Right? Is that like, in other words, we understand chashmal today as electricity. Is that what Ezekiel is saying? Is it really electricity? And is it fair to try to understand a word in the Bible based on the modern use of that word? So what I'm suggesting is that we're not sure exactly how to translate this. So I saw one wheel on the ground next to each of the four-faced creatures. As for the appearance and structure of the wheels, they gleamed like beryl. Okay, so I'm not a gem guy, so I don't know what color beryl is. So if anybody wants to type in there what they think beryl is, if you want to Google it, then that's what it is. But again, it's another word here. Tarshish is the word that's translated as beryl. And again, we're not sure exactly if that really is what that gem is, right? Is it right to translate Tarshish as beryl, or is it some other gem that we don't know? So, as for the appearance and structure of the wheels, they gleamed like beryl. All four had the same form. The appearance and structure of each was as of two wheels cutting through each other. So how are the wheels cut? Are they like this or like this? Not sure. So just one second. Okay. And when they moved, each could move in the direction of any of its four quarters. They did not veer when they moved. Their rims were tall and frightening, for the rims of all four were covered all over with eyes. So these wheels, the rims of the wheels, have had eyes on them. And when the creatures moved forward, the wheels moved at their sides, and when the creatures were born above the earth, the wheels were born too. Wherever the Spirit impelled them to go, they went. Wherever the Spirit impelled them, and the wheels were borne alongside them, for the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. Somehow Ezekiel was able to understand that the wheels determined how these creatures were going to move and where they were going to move. When those moved, these moved. And when those stood still, these stood still. And when those were born above the earth, the wheels were born alongside them. For the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. Okay, so if that's not bizarre enough, seeing these creatures and these wheels with eyes on the wheels. It sounds like a bad dream, or it sounds like, I don't know, a Harry Potter novel, or one of these just science fiction kind of things. And now we go on. Verse 22, above the heads of the creatures was a form, an expanse. Okay, so the Hebrew word is rakia, which we know from chapter 1 of Genesis. The rakia is the firmament there in Genesis. It's this expanse that separates between the heavens and the earth. There's this rakia, this firmament. So above the heads of the creatures was a form, an expanse, but the Hebrew is kerach, which in modern Hebrew is ice. Okay, thank you, Marjorie. A beryl includes emerald and aquamarine. So it's a greenish, bluish, turquoise-ish. No, emerald is green. Aquamarine is a greenish blue. So yeah, so that helps. That's if the word Tarshish is beryl, and if beryl is a greenish, bluish, then that's the gleam that's coming from these wheels and these creatures. Okay, so so that if that helps us picture this a little bit better. Okay, 22 again. Above the heads of the creatures was a form, an expanse. With the expanse is this kerach, which could be ice. Kerach in modern Hebrew is ice. With an so I don't know why they didn't translate it as ice. With an awe-inspiring gleam as of crystal. Oh, that could be the ice. The kerach being crystal was spread out above their heads. Under the expanse, so something is separating these creatures from something above them. Under the expanse, each one had one pair of wings extended toward those of the others, and each had another pair covering its bodies. But we knew that already, Ezekiel, okay? When they moved, I could hear the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters, like the sound of Shaddai. Like the sound of Shaddai. Just a second. Kekol Shaddai. How did Ezekiel know what Shaddai sounded like? That Shaddai is another word for God. So like the sound of Shaddai, a tumult, like the din of an army. When they stood still, they would let their wings droop. So the moving of their wings, the flapping of the wings made this sound like mighty waters and an army. From above the expanse over their heads came a sound. When they stood still, they would let their wings droop. Verse 26, above the expanse over their heads was the semblance of a throne. in appearance, yes, in appearance like sapphire. And this is translated as sapphire because the Hebrew word is sapir. So sapphire comes from the Hebrew sapir, so that you can understand. So sapphire is blue, a deep blue. And on top, upon the semblance of a throne, there was a semblance of human form. From what appeared as his loins up, I saw a gleam as of amber, what looked like a fire encased in a frame. And from what appeared as his loins down, I saw what looked like fire. There was a radiance all about him, like the appearance of the bow which shines in the clouds on a day of rain. Such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord. When I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. And then essentially it's the end of the Haftorah, because then what's added is verse 12 of verse 3. Then a spirit carried me away, and beheld behind me, I heard a great whirring sound. Blessed is the presence of the Lord in his place. So this is the Haftorah for the first day of Shavuot. So this appearance, before we talk about this a little bit, let me just say that the second paragraph of the intro refers us to other descriptions of this heavenly court. And quickly, let's just look. It refers to Exodus 24, which is 4 chapters after the 10 Commandments. There, then Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 elders of Israel ascended, that is Mount Sinai, and they saw the God of Israel under his feet. There was a likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. So there in the Torah itself, the Moses, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and 70 elders saw God, and under God's feet, pavement of sapphire. Okay, so there's that from Exodus. We also see in Kings, 1 Kings 22:19, a prophet describing what he sees. I saw the Lord seated upon his throne with all the host of heaven standing in attendance to the right and to the left of him. Okay, so there's a throne with attendants to the right and to the left. Isaiah, yes, let me just get to, I had that here, just a second. Yes, Isaiah 6. Here it is, 6, 2. No, 6, verse. I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his legs. And with 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So holy throne there, God has a robe. And here in Psalm 18, verses 11, he mounted a cherub and flew, gliding on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his screen, dark thunderheads dense. Out of the brilliance before him, hail and fiery coals pierced his clouds. Okay, so, and then one final vision is Daniel 7, verse 9. Thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His garment was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like lamb's wool. His throne was tongues of flame. Its wheels were blazing fire. So there's a commonality to these visions of God's heavenly throne. The commonality is that Ezekiel is not the only one who has a vision of a heavenly throne, not the only one that has a vision of angelic beings around this throne, and not the only one to see fire, coal, or some radiance come out of that, and also not the only one who claims that there's sapphire as a pavement under the throne. So the question I have is, what do we do with this? How do we make sense of this? Because I would argue, and not to make fun of this in any way, I would argue that, and I have not had this experience, I would argue that if one were taking LSD or were in some other kind of chemically induced trance, one might picture this, and one might, it wouldn't be surprising that this would be something that would be seen if one were under a chemically induced trance. So again, I don't want to make fun of this by suggesting that all of the references that I just shared do not make any reference to any of these people eating something first or drinking something first before seeing this, their whatever vision it was. So there wasn't something about smoking, eating, or drinking that could have induced this kind of vision. So I will say that this chapter prompted what is called in the Talmud by the rabbis, Merkava, Maaseh Merkava, the story, the incident of the chariot, because this is what this is, these wheels, God's throne being on wheels, it's described as a chariot, and therefore it was only those of sound mind who could actually study this, because otherwise it would make one crazy. So one had to be wise enough, smart enough, old enough, and spiritually strong enough to withstand I'm laughing because Bill had written privately about the LSD or the other chemically induced vision. He said, not my experience, but I'm not going to ask you to elaborate, Bill. So one had to be spiritually strong enough to study this in great detail to actually understand what this means. And so we have a story in the Talmud about 4 rabbis who entered the orchard, and only one survived to tell about it. And entering the orchard is another word, another way of saying entering God's heavenly court. So one went crazy, one died on the spot, one became an apostate, and only one survived. So that's for the rabbis, their understanding of what happens if we were to delve too deeply in understanding this. So the question is, what do we make of this? Another question is, why is this the Haftorah for the first day of Shavuot if the rabbis don't want us to read this and to understand it fully? So any thoughts that people want to share? Elizabeth, let me unmute you. Go ahead.
2 questions.
Yeah.
One is just a reference. What was the reference in Exodus that you gave?
Exodus 24, verse 9.
Okay. And then a question wasn't Eliyahu taken up in a chariot with wheels and fire and all of that?
Right. Yes. So what Elizabeth is referring to, the prophet Elijah, which is why Elijah is the one to herald the time of the Messiah. And Elijah is the one who we invite at the end of our Seder to come into our homes. And Elijah is the one who we invite every Saturday night when we do Havdalah. And Elijah is the one we invite at every bris, setting aside a chair for him. Is that according to 1 Kings, which describes the events of the prophet Elijah, his disciple is the prophet Elisha, and when it was time for Elijah to end his time on earth, he didn't die. He ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot. Okay, so the difference between that chariot and this is that chariot, it was just the vehicle to transport Elijah to heaven. Here, the chariot seems to be God's spaceship or God's throne with all these beings around it and the wheels. Okay, so yeah, so there's a difference there. So there are plenty of chariots described in the Bible, but the chariot for Elijah was a special vehicle just for Elijah. It wasn't God's heavenly throne. So any thoughts about what are we supposed to make of this? Does this inspire you in any way? Does this motivate you to want to have this kind of experience in your life, to see this? Marjorie. I unmuted you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I unmuted.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I ended up unmuted. I was wondering if this is one of the reasons that women were never allowed to study the Kabbalah, because they were not considered to be strong enough to withstand the mysticism of this
right. That's
volume. So do they refer to this Haftorah portion as one of their excuses? I'm using excuses. That's my word.
Yeah. No, I would agree with you. Yeah. So I would say that first and foremost, the rabbis have an attitude towards women that is not nice. They say across the board, women engage in gossip, and they are feeble-minded, not stupid, not lacking in common sense, but rather not sophisticated. Their minds are not sophisticated. So they wouldn't look to this first and foremost, but they would say, yes, women should not be allowed. Well, first of all, women didn't study Torah, the rabbi said, so you had to be knowledgeable in Torah first before you can then graduate, if you wish, to mysticism. And they didn't quite call it mysticism. They called it studying about the Merkavah, which mystics hundreds of years later, in producing the Zohar, that's how Merkavah became mysticism, and the text became the Zohar that to study. So if any of you have ever read any of the Zohar in English, and there is a new translation of the Zohar in English, I'm just getting up and yeah. So okay. Well, it's stuck on my shelf, and I put it there probably on purpose because I never pull it off my shelf. And so, anyway, if I do have another one here. Wait. Yeah. Okay, I forgot. I had one on another shelf. I had tried studying it before. So this is a modern scholarly translation of the Zohar by Daniel Matt. And I'm just going to read for you from the beginning of the Zohar. Now, when you read Midrash or you read anything in rabbinic literature, it kind of makes sense if you read it in English. When you read the Zohar in English, just as a lengthy introduction here, and let me get to the first page. Okay. Okay, so this is what the Zohar begins. Rabbi Chizkiah opened. Like a rose among thorns, so is my beloved among the maidens. So a verse from Song of Songs. Who is a rose? Assembly of Israel. Okay, so far so good. For there is a rose, and then there is a rose. Just as a rose among thorns is colored red and white, so Assembly of Israel includes judgment and compassion. Just as a rose has 13 petals, so Assembly of Israel has 13 qualities of compassion surrounding her on every side. Similarly, from the moment Elohim is mentioned, it generates 13 words to surround Assembly of Israel and protect her. Then it is mentioned again. Why again? To produce 5 sturdy leaves surrounding the rose. These 5 are called salvation. They are 5 gates. Concerning this mystery, it is written, I raise the cup of salvation. This is the cup of blessing, which should rest on 5 fingers and no more, like the rose sitting on 5 sturdy leaves. Paradigm of 5 fingers. This rose is the cup of blessing. So that's English, and you can understand that a little bit. But trust me that it gets more bizarre the more it goes on, and it becomes, yes, you know that you're reading English, but you have no understanding of what you're reading because of the different kind of method of study and interpretation that the rabbis of the mystical tradition use in understanding. So that is kind of what they do when they study this chapter of the book of Ezekiel. So again, I ask, what does this do for you? And why do you think we read this on the first day of Shavuot when the rabbis suggest that only if we're of sound mind should we be studying this chapter? Any thoughts or ideas about that? Elizabeth, I'll unmute you. Go ahead.
I don't know. I find all of these, like, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Daniel, Jeremiah, all of those, kind of like mystical readings. I find them interesting, and some, there are verses here and there that maybe I can connect with spiritually, but for the most part, I'm more like what you said earlier. How can I connect to Judaism and make it real for me in everyday life?
Right.
I'm not a mystic. I don't think that I will ever be a mystic. When I pray, when I am, davening sincerely, I do feel like I sense, that Hashem is real, that he's here, that he's with me. I connect to him. But all of these visions and stuff like that, if that actually occurred, I don't know what, probably, I don't know what I would do.
Right.
And I honestly don't know what to make of it. I mean, I'm not denying, I don't say this doesn't happen to these great prophets. Obviously, there was something there that's very significant. Otherwise, it would not be in the Tanakh.
Yeah.
It would not be included. So why we're having it on Shavuot, I'm not exactly sure either. So
let me just respond to
that one.
Yeah. So my one thing that what you said, Elizabeth, prompted is that about what Judaism is meant to provide a practical guide for us and what to do every day. And so therefore, and the rituals that we perform, the practices that we do, help connect us to history, and they make our lives a little bit more meaningful. And but for the rabbis, they also understood that there's life on earth and there's life in heaven, and the rabbis often try to connect to the heavenly. And that perhaps chapter 1 of Ezekiel, like other references and visions that prophets had of God's heavenly court, is really what life is supposed to be. That this is just life on earth as a temporary a temporary dwelling, and the ideal is to be living with God. And how can we get to God's world without being dead? In other words, when we die, our soul goes there, but how can we experience God's realm in our life today? And perhaps if we focus on this story and other incidents like this in an intense, mystical, trance-like way, perhaps we can transport our body and soul figuratively to that heavenly world. So Bill had a question. He had chatted private. Let me unmute you. You have to unmute yourself. Go ahead, Bill.
As to why they picked the Ezekiel to be the Haftorah, it seems to me the Mount Sinai moment is so mystical, so powerful.
Right.
And why not pick the most mystical Haftorah to that would seem to me to the connection.
Right. So that, yes, that's good. There's that too, that idea that, if the whole people of Israel were able to experience Mount Sinai, why is it that was the one and only time that an average Jew or an average Israelite was able to experience God's presence? The only time was only after that only prophets had this intense experience. So when we read the Mount Sinai experience, when it comes in chronological order, usually in January, we have Isaiah's vision of the heavenly court as the Haftorah. When we read it on Shavuot, we have Ezekiel's vision as the Haftorah. So both as this idea that perhaps the rabbis are saying that our spiritual ideal in being Jewish is to try to be in God's presence. So Marjorie, go ahead. I unmuted you.
Well, I think the reason that this Haftorah is read on Shavuot is Shavuot is the celebration of receiving
Right.
Torah.
Right.
And therefore talking about everybody, getting it together and the Mount Sinai thing and
right.
And the reason that everyone experiences the mysticism at that moment of God's presence is tied strongly to receiving they all received the Torah. It was not just
Right.
Moses,
Yes.
Aaron, everybody got it.
Right.
Therefore, everybody experienced the same thing.
Right.
We haven't gotten another Torah. We're still
Right.
dealing with the first one.
Right.
And that's why we don't get to experience any mysticism.
Yeah, so let me just add to that yes, it is Shavuot's about receiving the Torah, but even more so, it's hearing God's word. So Torah is the written is the written response it is God's word written down. So Mount Sinai is God's word written down and also God's word being heard. And perhaps the Haftorah is a sense of, it's one thing to study Torah and to live our life in the world here, but it's another thing to allow the words of Torah, God's word, to transport you in this mystical, spiritual way so you can hear God again. Howard, I'm trying to unmute you, but I can't. So you unmute yourself. Howard, go ahead.
I am unmuted.
Yes, go ahead. You have your
So
hand.
you want to get, if this is intended to scare me, it succeeded.
Uh-huh.
Right? If it was intended for me to fear God rather than love God, then it would succeed also. And if you look at this in the context of what was going on at the time, maybe it makes sense in that period when we're heading into exile and saying, don't remember, guys, there is this God here, right?
Uh-huh.
We're not going to have a centralized community of religion.
So interesting. So yes. So Ezekiel was frightened at first. It's unclear if he if he stayed frightened throughout, or whether he was comforted by the time he heard God's voice say, Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimekamo, blessed be God from his place. So, but to your other point, that this happened in exile. It happened in Babylonia. It didn't happen in the land of Israel. It didn't happen in Jerusalem. It didn't happen at Mount Sinai. It happened on the Kavar Canal in Babylon, which means to those of us still in diaspora outside of Israel, this experience can happen anywhere in the world. And so that, I think, is an important point too, especially for the rabbis choosing what the Haftorah should be for Shabbat and the holidays. I'm sure an element was because the rabbis themselves lived in exile in Babylonia, to say that though we look forward to returning to Jerusalem and the temple being rebuilt, let's know that we can be Jewish outside of the land of Israel, and we can even experience God's presence outside of Israel. No matter how fearful it might be at first, ultimately that's our goal. And Gabe, I unmuted you. Go ahead, and this will be the last question.
Is this what the Olam Haba is supposed to be like, the world after death, or is this something completely different?
So the wait, I'm sorry. Go ahead. What else?
Or is this something completely different that Ezekiel saw?
Right. So the rabbis claim, I don't want to say they make it up, but essentially they do make up what Olam Haba, the next world, is like. And the rabbis do say that the next world is also like the Messianic era, whenever the Messiah comes on earth. That that in Olam Haba, in this next world, what comes after this life, that our soul will experience, if our body dies in a state of purity or in a state of goodness, right? Or if our family members recite Mourner's Kaddish for us for the 11 months, then our soul will achieve its place in God's heavenly court. And therefore, God's heavenly court, what does it look like? It looks like this, what's described here in Isaiah and other places in the Bible. So yes, this is a sense of what Olam Haba is. But the point for the mystics is, we don't want to wait for Olam Haba to experience this. We want to experience it now. How can we experience it now? And the rabbis of the mystical tradition came up with incantations to recite, came up with liquid to drink, came up with food to consume that would help bring about this kind of, bring about this ability to enter into this trance to experience this. So for the mystics, there are 10 sfirot. There are 10 levels between this world and God's world, and the ideal is to climb those sfirot to get closer to God and to bring God down to us. So that when so there are elements of the mystical tradition that are there in the liturgy for us. So when we go up on our toes for each word of Kadosh 3 times, when we say the Kedusha, Kadosh, 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 and we raise ourselves up 3 times, a little bit higher each time, that's the idea. We're trying to get to God's presence and get closer to God that way. So we've only touched on the surface here of this bizarre Haftorah. We haven't really had the opportunity before to study this Haftorah, and I thought it would be interesting to do that today and to understand that, so there are people who see that their spiritual quest is to get to God's presence. And for Judaism, it's to get to God's presence while also being a good person and fulfilling the commandments. So in Judaism, this vision of Ezekiel goes hand in hand with observing the 10 commandments, which means observing the 613 commandments. So if if our goal as a Jew would be to only experience what Ezekiel experienced, that would be wrong. And if you're not fully being Jewish. And if our goal is to observe the 613 commandments and not have this mystical experience, we're not fully Jewish either. The ideal is to bring the two together, and perhaps that's another lesson of why this is the Haftorah. Don't think that it's all about fulfilling the commandments. It's also about trying to have this spiritual and mystical experience in life too. All right, so Shabbat. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. There's a 7:30 minyan tonight for anybody who's interested in that. And tomorrow, of course, tomorrow evening is Shavuot. So there is tomorrow at 5, I'll have from 5 to 6, I'll have a lesson that a study session that I'll be teaching. And there are links also for other study sessions to do throughout the evening that you saw on the website. So have a good day, everybody.
Everybody have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Joe.